As part of CACI's commitment to the public sector, we partner with the Local Area Research and Intelligence Association, or LARIA for short. Our principal role has been to share best practice and promote effective use of data, which has also been supported by many of our public sector clients. CACI have also presented at many LARIA conferences and webinars where we focused on key sector challenges and shared valuable insights that can be used to evidence decision making. We've recorded a series of video podcasts that will provide viewers with an introduction to LARIA, insights drawn from a recent member survey, as well as discuss challenges linked to the cost of living. Over the course of the last year, CACI has been running a survey to assess the impact of the cost of living on the UK population. Insights drawn from the survey have been shared via a series of podcasts, and in this session, my colleague Rosie Clarke will present some of the latest survey results, which we'll then discuss with a distinguished panel of LARIA members.
Hi, I'm Rosie Clarke and I work in the location analytics team at CACI, and today I'm going to be presenting some of the findings from CACI's most recent cost of living survey. The aim of this is to provide some useful and tangible insights for LARIA. So, what we will talk about today is details around the survey, how it is conducted, what insights can it provide, and the headlines around cost of living. A couple of the main topic areas will be how and where people live. In this, we will look at the implication to residents, whether that be being able to afford houses or being able to afford the related payments. We'll also look to break this down by different demographic groups, specifically focusing on the effects to the most vulnerable communities. Secondly, we will look at health and well-being. This will consider both mental and personal well-being. And then linked to this, we will look at the usage of food banks and the rising use of these. Finally, we will end with some key takeaways to consider and to discuss further. So we all know there is human impacts to the rising cost of living. This is increasing people's fixed costs and reducing people's disposable income. We will look into how the rising cost of living are impacting people differently and affecting their behaviours and attitudes, considering both the impacts to different generations, consumer groups and levels of affluence. We'll also explore both attitudinal and what is actually happening to consumers' behaviours. This, all in all, will help LARIA to provide the right services and policies to best support local communities. So in order to provide relevant and impactful insights, CACI issue a survey to around 2,000 respondents each quarter. This is both nationally and demographically represented to provide as accurate results as possible. It captures things like what people are thinking, how people feel, and how they are planning to change. It also considers who is impacted the most. What we aim to do with this is to support LARIA in helping them to provide support for their residents in their communities. The results of the survey have been analysed using CACI's consumer segmentation ACON. This slide here introduces you to that. New ACON has 7 different categories, 22 groups and 64 types. For this analysis, we've focused on the categories. Every postcode in the UK is given an ACON demographic classification, and broadly these range from the most affluent at the top to the least affluent at the bottom. It's used to identify and to target residents for upcoming projects or demand needs more effectively. Further information can be provided on this if required. 54% of people are concerned about their personal finances, and we look at this across the different quarters. It's been relatively stable throughout this year, but there is still a high proportion of people that are concerned about their personal finances. When we break this down by a different demographic group, we can see that the lowest income groups are significantly more concerned and therefore the most vulnerable. So when we break this down by income and our consumer segmentation, the length of the bar shows that the absolute income. So you can see that the most affluent consumer groups at the top have the most income, and then the colour ranges based on the different outgoings. So you can see then on the right hand side you have the disposable income that's left. So in broad terms, as you've got the wealthier at the top and the less affluent at the bottom, you can see that sort of varying disposable income. We can see that age is a big driver of disposable income, so the younger affluent groups are the most squeezed on disposable income. You can see here that the light blue shows the housing costs that are dominated in these categories, showing that they're spending a lot on housing, and therefore this is squeezing their disposable income. Whereas for the less affluent groups, the income is much lower, but their main concerns are around food and housing being much more significant proportion of their outgoings, so they already face a squeeze to income. And finally, the older audience in the purple boxes, wherever they sit on the affluent scale, they're keeping the greater proportion of their income. That's largely driven by smaller housing commitments, such as typically much lower fixed outgoings. This slide looks at what people think the impacts will be on their household in the coming months. We can see here that the top three, which have remained consistently high, are unsurprising. These include using less energy, buying fewer luxuries, and switching to cheaper brands. However, we see that missing payments on utility bills and council tax and rent are also significant factors here. And potentially these are a trigger for people going to arrears, accumulating unpaid debt, and these are a particular area of focus for us. When we break this down by ACON group, we can start to see some real differences in the consumer segmentation groups on concerns around missing payments. We can see that the less affluent groups to the most affluent groups on the missing payments doubles. Buy now and pay later schemes also show a big difference in the different demographic groups. This can create real problems, and we need to understand what can be done to support these people, help understand what people in these communities are going through, and making more informed decisions, shaping policies and planning interventions. So the first topic we're going to look at is housing, considering where and how people live. So some of the top line concerns when considering where people currently live, what they're most concerned about is that interest rates are staying high. This leads to residents being unable to afford their mortgages, and therefore we expect to see more people considering other options. We are also aware that the rental market prices are also increasing. This is putting pressure on individuals. This means that people are also considering multiple other options for their housing. We can see here that 13% of people are concerned about being priced out of their local area. This may mean that more people will require council or social housing. We also expect to see increased migration between local authorities as people look to find more affordable areas to live, contributing to the economic migration of people. When we start to split this down again by ACON group, we can see that all categories are worried about not being able to live at their current level of comfort. But the real differences are between the least affluent, who are worried about not being able to get onto the property ladder when they had hoped to. This means that people are staying in rental accommodation much longer, and it also leads back to this point around migration, particularly for the least affluent groups as they look to move to more affordable areas. Again, when we break this down even further into different types of households, so whether this be people who own their own house, people who are renting in social housing or private renters, we start to see the differences between the people's concerns. Missing utility bills and council tax is highest among renters compared to people who own their own house. So you've got 12 and 13% compared to 4 to 5% for those owning a house. Accumulating debt will lead to people most likely to use buy now and pay later schemes, bringing further problems to people's finances. What is even more striking is when we add children under 18 into the household, this creates even bigger disparities. So if you look at the missing utility bills category, you can see that 47% of people are concerned about this compared to just 15% with those that don't have children. This is a really big, stark difference and is an area of concern for us. So the next section for us is looking at health and well-being. The first question asks what people are most concerned about for the coming year. Whilst we can see that rising costs remain consistently at the top, a large proportion of people are also worried about their mental and personal well-being. We can see on average that 62% of people are worried about either their mental or personal well-being. However, when we split this out by the lowest demographic groups, looking at low-income living group alone, this rises over 10% to 73% of the population, which is strikingly high. What can be done to help alleviate or present these concerns? Signposting to support local services is something that we need to consider going forward. When we split this down by different ACON groups, there is most disparity in the health and well-being concerns. When we look at the concerns, the least affluent and the youngest are the most effective, but we think this is for different reasons. The least affluent groups, we think this is due to the cost of living. People are pressured on their finances, and therefore our concerns are raised around their mental health. Whereas for the younger population, people are more aware of mental health problems and also impacts of COVID, such as their social engagement and also rising use of social media, we think has impacted their mental health. We can see here that people's mental health and physical well-being is affecting all different groups. We see that Gen Z is the most impacted on mental health, whereas it's less common in the baby boomers and older demographic groups. This is most likely due to awareness, as mental health has only more recently been talked about. it's still a primary concern for most generations. So next, we look at food banks. We look at both the reported and expected usage of food banks, which is rising. The graph shows here the blue line, which shows have people used food banks in the last 12 months, whereas the red line shows would you consider using a food bank within the next 12 months. And we recognise that there is a process around using a food bank in that people need to be referred to these to be able to use one. People using a food bank is definitely increasing. 1 in 11 have used a food bank in the past year. The expected usage is also increasing. Whilst there's a common awareness that food banks is increasing, we want to understand what can be done to help support these people using them. How we can support them in the best way, whether that be working through food bank organisations or other means. Again, we break this down by ACORN demographic group and look at the presence of children in a household. Here we see that there is a stark difference in the less affluent groups and those with children. Among the least affluent groups, incidence of food bank usage in the last 12 months has doubled in houses with children present. So we really want to understand how these people can be best supported. So to provide a bit of a summary on how some of these factors that we've talked about today have changed over time, we've looked at some of the difference in responses from year on year. So looking at September 2022 to September 2023. And we can see a lot of the responses are either getting worse or not getting any better. Expected food bank usage is the only one that's getting better across the different demographic groups. Missing bills is getting the worst for the lowest income groups, and that's a particular concern for us. So to summarise, it is clear that the impacts of cost of living are affecting people differently. The lower affluent groups are worried about being priced out of their local area. This is leading to economic migration and movement of people between local authorities. Secondly, we saw that 73% of low-income living groups are concerned about their mental or personal well-being. And then finally, we saw that food bank usage is rising, particularly among those with children under 18 years old.
Thank you, Rosie, for that presentation. It was really great to hear all about the work that we've been doing. Plenty of information to talk about. And I'd like to now introduce you to Juliet Whitworth, who is Head of Research and Information at the Local Government Association, and Paul Holme, who is Head of Performance, Research and Intelligence at Manchester City Council. Hi both, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
We've got a couple of points to pick up on. I think Rosie ended the presentation with 3 takeaways, which I think are really valid for us to talk about today. So the first point that she ended on was that lower affluent groups are worried about being priced out of their local area and having to move elsewhere. Paul, for local authorities who are seeing this happen, people are moving away from where they currently live and actually maybe into affordable areas, which then poses problems for other local authorities across the country. What's your experience of this?
Yeah. So I think it's important to open up on the point around segmentation itself, because I don't think cost of living and housing issues affect different households in the same way. I think there's lots of variation within there, whether we're talking about young people, as we heard in the pack, or whether we're talking about mortgage holders or renters. It's a complex picture. I think the other aspect is that it's not one group who are feeling cost of living crisis from a static point, and there are some households who haven't got that choice to move. So whilst we do see some of that pressure, we've got some residents who actually haven't got anywhere else to move. They are already in the most affordable accommodation. They haven't got the opportunity to look elsewhere and move out of the borough. And likewise, Manchester might not be the place that attracts people to the most affordable accommodation. But it is a real thing. And the impact for us will be on social housing. The impact that we may start to feel on rents, we are already feeling on rents. We are seeing that landlords are having to increase prices because their cost pressures are increasing. They're pushing rents up. That's putting additional pressure on private sector renters. We haven't got enough affordable social stock to be able for people to move into. But that's a real challenge. The other challenge within local authority is actually, where do you set that rent price?
Sure.
So our social landlords will be feeling the cost pressures as well. Is it ethical for us to put our rents up? Maybe we've got no choice, but actually there's a very complex picture within there that residents may or may not be able to move, there may or may not be the accommodation available.
Yeah.
And they're some of the things that we're grappling with at the moment. I suppose just to come back to this point around sort of the different segments of the population, I think that's a really vital point from the pack, because there are some aspects where if a household is already in social accommodation, they may have some ability of support from their social landlord already. There'll be others that haven't, and we need to understand those differences across just within our district alone, even before we think about some of those cross-border issues.
Sure. And with those people who are in an environment where they can't really move, what can the council actually sort of do to support them? How do you use data to help you with that challenge?
Yeah. So we've done a lot of this analysis locally as well, taken the same approach, taken the sort of segmentation analysis that you've shared, to try and understand where we do some of that short-term response. So where, in a sense, do we get money into people's pockets in different ways to be able to smooth and even out some of the crises at the moment, but also build that into our longer-term planning. Where are the communities, where are the areas that we might need to do something differently with? And within that longer term planning, that's not just about council response, that's about social landlords, that's about other public services, that's about how we invest in regeneration at a local area, and all sorts of complex things that link to that.
And Juliet, from an LGA point of view, I mean, obviously you talk to local authorities all the time. Is what Paul is saying what you're hearing from the people that you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really live topic of conversation, and I think actually what the presentation did really nicely was shows the power of that segmentation. As Paul said, it's not everyone can move, and understanding who those less affluent people are who are really feeling the pressure in enough detail, for example, to understand whether they have children at school or not, because their ability to move might really be affected by that. They may not be willing to move their children out of school or able to move their children out of school. You need to know that. You can't just assume that everyone on low income has got this, the same reaction to finding themselves in difficulties like that. So understanding that's really important. Certainly the things that Paul has described, we know that local authorities across the country are trying to do to help their residents. I would say as well, the value of the data where you can see it not just in your own area, but in neighbouring areas. It may not be your residents who are leaving. It may be that other councils' residents might be more likely to move to your area, and certainly that is the case for some councils, that they're receiving people rather than losing people, as it were. So understanding the pattern not only of your own area but the surrounding areas can be really important as well, and that can be quite a long distance as well. Around cities, because cities, the expense of cities actually goes quite a way out into commuter zones and out the other side. So
what you're both saying is there's quite a lot of factors that actually determine how you might respond or what you need to do in order to actually help people. And actually data is critical to being able to inform decision making on that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. I think, there's never been a time where data's been as important in informing our way forward and our decisions. One of the things that I know we've talked about in other conversations is the timeliness of data.
Yeah.
And actually, how do we make sure that we've got data that helps us make decisions now? Whilst it's great to look back, it's not great to understand today. And actually, the crisis is today. And that's the type of thing we're trying to work through. So some of the approaches that we've taken with analytics and our use of data is to maybe look for simpler analytics, simpler metrics, but more timely ones.
Sure.
And everything that we've heard today, I'm not saying it's simple, it's not simple, but actually within there, the messages are simple, and actually it gives our decision makers something tangible to act on now, rather than us trying to wait for the perfect answer, the perfect solution, because it's not a perfect time.
Fantastic.
I would really agree with that. I think the importance of data, I think over the years where money has been tight, authorities of course have to protect frontline services.
Of course.
But actually that having the evidence, arguably it's more important now than ever because there isn't a lot of money to go around. So understanding where to target that becomes really important. And it's why the LGA as well runs a data programme to support councils to make better use of data for exactly that reason. Now more than ever, we need to be using it really effectively to target what money is available.
Yeah, I mean, Kate, Chair of LARIA, was talking about doing more but with less. So ultimately, that's exactly what you're saying. It's just using it in a more efficient way. We also talked about low-income living groups who are particularly concerned about their mental and personal well-being. What were the stats, Rosie?
So we actually found that 73% of low-income living groups were concerned about their mental and physical well-being. And this was 63% for the whole population. So we see that it's definitely increasing along the lower affluence groups.
That's quite a stark statistic. And we know that with cost of living, health, whether you're in a good job or not, it all has an effect on how you are. So what are the kind of things that the councils can actually sort of do to support, and what's your thoughts on the statistics that we presented today?
I think what was interesting about that was, although it was really high for low affluent groups, it did feature in some of the other groups as well, suggesting that there is a broad effect across the piece. I guess local authorities have a public health duty, and looking at that makes me realise that actually that's the sort of information that our public health teams will be wanting to look at and using in terms of some of their prevention role.
Sure.
And improving the health of the population level, rather than waiting until things are getting so bad that you're dealing with crises at the end of it. So that feels to me really important.
And again, I'd agree on that. I think there's an issue around sort of current crisis, and there are families, households where I suppose this is rock bottom in terms of pressures and demands that are being placed on them.
Yeah.
And it's no surprise then to see that those same groups come through in the analysis as being those that are most worried and concerned about their own well-being and the family's well-being, which I think is right. I think there's a cumulative effect of some of this, which I think you've just touched on, is the cumulative effect on service demand, and actually taking some decisions now to be able to mitigate some of those further crises into the future. And how do we do that? I suppose, if I'm being brutally honest, we can't afford to support everybody.
Sure.
That's an impossible task.
Yeah.
But actually, how do you pick the groups? It sounds really bad, but how do you pick the groups in the right way to be able to prioritise services that then means that you have got a model that supports as many people in the right way at the right time?
I think it kind of goes back to what Juliet was saying on the previous response, which is, where you need to do more but with less. You would be using data and insight in order to actually help you prioritise who it is that you help and in which way that you help them.
I think also, though, picking up on something, Paul, you said in response to the question about housing, you can also use data as part of your conversations to discuss with other partners what you might do together. And so an authority on its own may not have the resources to help a large number, but actually if you can make the case to local health partners, for instance, that actually investing now to save their budget down the line, that it's a way of bringing you all together with a shared priority, with evidence that this can make a difference. And I think that's also really important.
No, it is, and it's interesting as well that from some of those partners we do get that perspective that they've got as well. So actually, it's not just the council and the council's data, or data that we subscribe to with other partners. That on the ground anecdotal understanding of what's happening day by day, what support needs are that are happening within our communities. We recently did a bit of a tour around our city, looking at different places, talking to different partners, trying to understand the different pressures in different communities. And one of the things that surprised me, somebody who's immersed in data and research and evidence every day, was our fairly affluent young professionals in the city centre were suffering significant mental health, anxiety around the fact that they've signed up to, I suppose, a lifestyle, a long-term commitment to the city, the rents and other things, that actually, if we ran our analysis on the most vulnerable, there would be nowhere near that.
Sure.
But that partnership approach, say actually these are the people who are really worried about this. It might not be today, but in next year, the next 12 months, the next 24 months,
Sure.
they might be the people next coming through our door. So it's really important, that partnership part.
Yeah.
And interestingly, that's what we're seeing as well. So in the conversations we're having are moving towards much more of a wider partnership approach to data. We've got almost whole regions who are now kind of trying to work together, whether that's emergency services, local government, health, all using the same data in order to kind of help them respond accordingly to what's going on. One of the other things I did want to touch on is, with it being a two-tier local authority system, we have some authorities who shy away from health and wellbeing because they're not mandated. What do you say to that? And how would you advise those authorities to approach it? Because some of the services they provide are reliant on health and wellbeing of their population.
I suspect they're doing health and wellbeing without realising it. Even though it's not mandated, a lot of those district level services, for example, around leisure and sport and things, are really, really key to health. So they may not recognise they're doing it, but I think in most cases, if not all, there's quite a lot of work between counties and district authorities in this area, and certainly they can, it can be justified from the data.
And is there anything you'd like to comment on that?
Yeah, and I suppose it links back to what we talked about a few minutes ago in terms of sort of short-term and longer-term view and vision and priorities. In the short term, maybe the focus is around some of those mandated things. This is what we need to deliver as a county council now, today. This is our priority. Our budgets are as tight as everybody else's, so therefore that's a priority today. But if we don't collectively think about that longer term, actually some of the impacts will be felt in the services that they provide and are responsible for, in the same way that they may be with a local authority or a partner. And actually that's where we need to join up that sort of slightly longer term look and vision, because short term response is critical.
Yeah.
But actually, if we don't do that in a long term planned way, then we've got a real problem.
Indeed. That's great. Thanks for your insights on that. Food bank usage, as we've seen, is on the rise. Now, Rosie, can you just remind us of the stats again?
Yeah, so what we found is that food bank usage is increasing, particularly along those people with children under the age of 18 in their households. Have you experienced this?
Yeah. So absolutely, we're seeing it like everywhere else in the country. I think what the analysis shows is that rapid increase over the last 12 months, but I think it hasn't been a new thing for places like Manchester and other places in the country. The use of food banks has been a key part of society for a long time now, which is not ideal.
Yeah.
I think what we've started to see is that rapid escalation of food bank use, but we've also started to see, I suppose, some new norms around that, and actually now it's becoming part of everyday living and everyday ways of working for services and for households. I think the analysis touched on the cumulative effect, that actually when we look at people approaching food banks for the first time and the stark numbers that you showed around what that might look like over the next 12 months, the even starker numbers are the people who are already currently reliant on food banks and need to use them day to day at the moment. So within the local authority, our challenges are around sort of supporting the voluntary sector to be able to deliver those services, and actually enabling them to do the job that they do so brilliantly in an effective and efficient way that supports as many families as possible. But it also has some links to other policies and other services as well. Things like free school meals. Manchester's supported free school meals through summer holidays. And that's been investment and a budget pressure that the council has had to undertake and commit to. But that's the right thing to do. As we touched on the last question, we don't do that now. You create other crises and other problems, and actually the cumulative cost and effect to individuals and service demand is much bigger if you don't support that right now. It's a horrible place to be.
Yeah.
But the reality is, yes, I agree, it is such a big part of sort of cost of living crisis and day-to-day living at the moment.
And I know that in Manchester, that clearly you've got experience of that. For those authorities who are perhaps either at the beginning of that kind of journey, if I could say that, what advice would you give them to kind of support or work with food banks to help residents and communities?
Yeah, so in Manchester, we've had a sort of long-term relationship with the voluntary sector. We've got really established sort of networks and governance around that. We've been able to prioritise some of those, I suppose, emergency budgets and some of those investments in those areas and those networks to be able to say this is the way that we support you to support our residents, rather than the council being the vehicle to do everything, as we touched on before.
Yeah.
So I think that's the main learning and advice. I'm probably telling lots of people watching this something, they already know because lots of councils are doing the same thing.
Yeah.
But I suppose the thing that I would say I think we've done particularly well is the investment in the partnership approach. And actually, it's not the voluntary sector over there and the council over here. It's actually a partnership and a connected way of delivering those services.
And actually data, I guess, is part of that as well. Yeah. So being able to work in partnership, but actually identify the areas where resources, through these food banks should be prioritised.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and linked to data specifically. We had a picture of where we thought demand might be in the city, but you've also got to draw some of that data from some of that local intelligence as well for actually who does come through the door, where do the referrals come from, what are the types of conditions that people are approaching sort of voluntary sector with.
Really important, because obviously the data that we see in the pack is about those who are already claiming, and as we've discussed, you get referred, you can't just bowl up. So it's people who have made a connection with an organisation that can refer them, but there will also be people who haven't made that connection yet, and the characteristics of those people, you might hypothesise that, looking at those who have already been referred, where are the other people like that who we don't have a connection yet? So there's certainly something around using the data for that. And then I think also the partnership work with the voluntary sector, I do agree, is really important. It's not just about the crises, and you mentioned this already. If you can find sustainable approaches to helping people with food poverty, then things like food clubs, allotments, groups coming together to in a community to grow, that can make a longer term difference. And so I think that's really important as well.
There is, and actually just made me think about, I suppose how we close the circle on some of this discussion. Really, actually, there's a link back to housing and the support that you may get through a partnership there. Touched on before the role of social landlords and social housing. What we do see in some of our referrals is, if you are a social tenant, you get tenancy support, and actually you can see that referral happen quite quickly.
Right.
If you're a private rented resident with no real connections and not able to connect into the system easily, you might come through at a much later stage in more crisis. And absolutely the role of data in that helps us understand, well, where can we be assured that this person, this family, this household may be picked up and supported, and where are the risks in the city where somebody may fall through the crack.
It's about comms and engagement, awareness. I guess that's where where data and intelligence is going to fit, because if you can find out who these people are, that's what you do.
And then use it to bring partners together.
Yeah.
To push in the same direction, so that they're all looking at the same evidence. I think that's really important.
Brilliant. That brings us to the end of our session today. We hope that you've enjoyed the content. If you'd like to find out more about what we've talked about today, or you'd like to find out more about LARIA or CACI, please click on the links on screen. Thank you for joining us.